My name is Luna. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being calm, capable, and agreeable. The kind of woman people describe as strong because she doesn't complain, and lucky because she seems to hold everything together without making noise about it. I've been a wife, a daughter-in-law, a professional, and for a long time, the quiet center of a household that depended on my stability more than it ever acknowledged my humanity. People often mistook my silence for softness, my patience for acceptance, and my willingness to endure as proof that I was fine. I'm telling this story not because I want sympathy, and not because I'm looking for villains to point at. I'm telling it because there is a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives politely. It arrives disguised as duty, hope, and love. This is the story of how I risked everything to give birth to a son, to keep my husband, and how that decision slowly, quietly unraveled my life in ways I couldn't undo. For years, I believed that if I just fulfilled one more expectation, carried one more burden, sacrificed one more piece of myself, things would stabilize. I believed a child could save my marriage, not out of desperation, but out of faith. Faith in promises, in family narratives, in the idea that effort is always rewarded. What followed was not a dramatic collapse. There were no sudden betrayals, no public scandals, no moments designed for outrage. Instead, there was pressure, expectation, a narrowing of my choices until what I called love began to feel like a chain made of obligations I could no longer set down. This story is about the slow normalization of being unseen, about how praise can coexist with erasure, about how a woman can be central to everyone's life and still be treated as replaceable. It's also about consequence, not revenge, not triumph, but consequence. The kind that unfolds after you make a choice, believing it will heal everything, only to realize too late that it has cost you more than you knew how to measure. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't dramatize pain for effect. And I won't pretend I didn't participate in my own undoing. This is an honest account of how hope, when shaped by other people's expectations, can become a trap. If you've ever stayed quiet because you thought endurance was love, if you've ever made a life-altering choice, hoping it would finally earn you safety, if you've ever wondered when being strong started costing you yourself, then maybe you'll recognize parts of your own story in mine. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever mistaken sacrifice for security? To the people around me, I was easy to define. I was the reasonable one, the dependable one, the woman who didn't make situations heavier than they already were. At work, I was the person managers trusted with projects that needed patience and follow through. Not the flashy assignments, not the visible wins, but the ones that quietly kept systems from breaking. When something went wrong, my name was mentioned. When something went right, it simply disappeared into team effort. At home, I played a similar role without ever naming it. I was the emotional regulator, the one who remembered birthdays, noticed tensions before they turned into arguments, smoothed conversations before voices were raised. My husband often described me as low maintenance, and he meant it as praise. What he didn't realize was that low maintenance doesn't mean low need. It usually means unmet needs that learn to stay quiet. His family loved me. Or at least, they appreciated me. I cooked without complaint, listened without correcting, and adapted without asking for space. I learned early that being liked was easier when I didn't disrupt the existing order. I wasn't expected to be complicated, just functional. And I was very good at functioning. No one ever called me weak. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine invisibility. I wasn't dismissed because I lacked strength. I was dismissed because my strength made things convenient. I absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. When decisions were made, I was informed after the fact. When plans changed, I adjusted. When expectations shifted, I met them quietly. Not because anyone forced me, but because I had internalized the idea that harmony was my responsibility. I told myself stories to make it make sense. This is what partnership looks like. Not every role needs the spotlight. Stability is more important than recognition. And for a long time, those stories worked. My husband wasn't cruel. That's important to say. He was practical, goal oriented, and deeply influenced by his family's values. In his world, progress had a shape: career advancement, legacy, continuation. He spoke often about the future in terms of milestones, not feelings. When he talked about us, he meant structure. When I talked about us, I meant connection. Those differences didn't seem dangerous at first. They felt complementary. I believed my emotional awareness balanced his pragmatism. I believed my flexibility made us stronger. What I didn't see, or didn't want to see, was how easily flexibility becomes erasure when it only flows in one direction. People assumed I was content because I rarely expressed dissatisfaction. They assumed silence meant agreement. Even I started to believe that if something truly mattered, I would feel it loudly enough to demand space. But some losses are quiet. Some needs don't scream, they just fade. When conversations turn toward expectations about marriage, timing, children, I listened more than I spoke. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was still translating my inner life into language I thought others would understand. And while I was translating, decisions were being made. I was praised for being supportive. I was thanked for being understanding. I was admired for being so calm about everything. What no one asked was whether calm was a choice or a survival strategy. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role already was. I just hadn't named it yet. I was the foundation, unseen once the house was standing. Essential, but not consulted about renovations. I didn't feel angry. I felt useful. I didn't feel trapped. I felt needed. And that's the most dangerous place to be without realizing it. Because when your value is measured by how much you can carry, the moment you stop carrying, everything changes. At the time, though, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought I was secure. I thought I had earned my place by being steady. I didn't know yet that steadiness, when taken for granted, becomes silence. And silence, when unexamined, becomes permission. The first time it happened, it was so small that I almost missed it. We were having dinner with his parents. Nothing formal, just a quiet Sunday evening. His mother was talking about a distant relative's pregnancy. How quickly things had progressed once they stopped overthinking it. She laughed lightly, the way people do when they think they're being helpful. Then she turned to me and said, almost casually, You're not getting any younger, you know. The table went quiet for half a second. Not long enough to be uncomfortable, just long enough for everyone to register the comment and then move past it. My husband smiled, not maliciously, not apologetically either. He reached for his water glass and said, "She knows." That was it. No correction, no reframing, no acknowledgement that something personal had just been placed on the table like a shared concern. I smiled too, reflexively. I even nodded, as if we were all discussing the weather. Inside, something tightened, not sharply, not painfully. It felt more like a thread being pulled, just enough to let me know it existed. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I mentioned it, carefully. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. "I felt a little exposed earlier," I said, "when your mom brought up my age like that." He paused, toothbrush in hand, and looked genuinely surprised. "She didn't mean anything by it," he said. "You know how she is, and it's not like she's wrong." That sentence landed harder than the comment itself. It's not like she's wrong. It reframed the moment from something that hurt me into something factual, neutral, even logical. And facts, I had learned, were not meant to be argued with emotionally. I nodded again. That had become my instinct by then. "I know," I said. "I just wanted you to know how it felt." He leaned in and kissed my forehead, already moving on. "You're too sensitive about these things," he said gently. "We're on the same team." On the same team, that phrase stayed with me. Because teams are supposed to protect each other in public. They don't leave one player exposed and call it strategy. But I didn't push further. I told myself it wasn't worth creating tension. That it was one comment, one moment, one misunderstanding. That's how the first small cut works. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't scar immediately. It just introduces the idea that your discomfort is less important than everyone else's comfort. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, just as minor, just as easy to excuse. A joke about how career women always wait too long. A comment about how men need heirs eventually. A conversation that continued around me as if I were a concept, not a person. Each time, I felt that same internal tightening. Each time, I released it. I told myself I was being mature, rational, understanding of cultural context, generational differences, and practical realities. And each time, my silence confirmed something I didn't yet see, that my boundaries were optional. What hurt wasn't the pressure itself, it was the assumption, the unspoken agreement between everyone else, that my body, my timeline, my future were reasonable topics for group discussion, and that I would absorb it, like I always did. I started paying attention after that, not in a suspicious way, just more awake. I noticed how often expectations were presented as inevitabilities, how rarely anyone asked what I wanted as opposed to when. I noticed how quickly emotional nuance was brushed aside in favor of outcomes. Most of all, I noticed how easily love could coexist with entitlement. That was the first small cut, not because it was cruel, but because it taught me something about my place. I learned that being valued didn't mean being protected, that being loved didn't guarantee being defended, and that if I wanted safety, I would have to decide whether silence was truly serving me or slowly shaping me into someone easier to overlook. At the time, I still believed I could manage it, adjust around it, carry it quietly like everything else. I didn't yet understand that small cuts, when left unattended, don't heal, they deepen. Once something happens more than once, it starts to acquire a different weight. The second time didn't feel like a cut. It felt like a pattern trying to introduce itself. It showed up in conversations that followed a familiar rhythm. Someone would say something about children, timing, and legacy. Someone else would nod, and then, without ceremony, the focus would drift toward me. Not my face, not my thoughts, but my function. What's the plan then? You don't want to regret waiting. Men don't have the same luxury with time, you know. Every sentence was delivered calmly, reasonably, as if we were all aligned on the premise that this was a shared logistical problem that simply needed solving. At first, I answered carefully. I used neutral language. I spoke about balance, health, and career stability. I framed my responses in ways that sounded responsible, not resistant. I didn't say, I'm not ready. I said, we're thinking about it. I didn't say, this pressure scares me. I said, we want to do it right. And each time I did that, the room relaxed, as if reassurance had been provided, as if I had confirmed what everyone needed to hear. My husband never contradicted me, but he rarely reinforced me either. His silence worked differently than mine. Mine was adaptive. He was permissive. Later, in private, he would explain, they're just worried about us. You know how important family is to them. We can't keep postponing forever. Those conversations were never arguments. They were discussions, calm, measured, almost corporate in tone, pros and cons, timelines, risk assessments. What they weren't was emotional. When I tried to explain that the constant commentary made me feel reduced, he would look confused. Reduced to what? He'd ask. This is just part of life. And that's when I started questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was this simply the reality of marriage? That individual preferences eventually yield to shared expectations? Was my discomfort just immaturity dressed up as introspection? I didn't want to be unreasonable. I didn't want to be the obstacle to progress. I had built too much of my identity around being supportive, adaptable, and capable. So I normalized it. I told myself that love sometimes requires endurance, that respect doesn't always look like protection, that being chosen as a wife meant accepting the future that came with the role. I noticed, though, how the language shifted over time. It stopped being if and became when. It stopped being your thoughts and became our plan. It stopped being about my body and became about his timeline. And still, no one raised their voice. No one issued ultimatums. That's what made it so easy to dismiss the unease. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives fully dressed as reason. The more I stayed quiet, the more confident everyone became. Confidence is contagious. It grows in the absence of resistance. Eventually, I began to preempt the conversations. I'd bring it up myself, offer updates that no one had asked for, frame delays as strategic rather than emotional. I thought that by controlling the narrative, I was protecting myself. In reality, I was training everyone, including myself, to see my inner world as negotiable. There was a moment that crystallized it for me, though I didn't fully understand it at the time. We were at a gathering, and someone joked, well, at least you know what your purpose will be soon. They laughed. I laughed too, softly. Inside, I felt something detach. Purpose. Not a partnership. No choice. Purpose. On the drive home, I stared out the window and realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me what I wanted, without immediately reframing it around feasibility, not desire, feasibility. That's when normalization completed its work, when the extraordinary becomes routine, when the uncomfortable becomes background noise, when your silence stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like the default setting. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. I was being slowly repositioned from participant to resource. And the most unsettling part was how complicit I had become. Because every time I chose calm over clarity, harmony over honesty, I taught them how to treat me. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt tired, tired of translating myself into acceptable language, tired of carrying a future I hadn't fully agreed to, tired of being told that this was just how things worked. I still believed I could manage it. I still believed that once the next milestone was reached, the pressure would ease. I didn't yet understand that milestones don't end expectations. They multiply them. Roles are rarely announced. No one sits you down and says, "This is who you will be from now on." They emerge quietly through repetition, reward, and consequence. By the time I noticed mine clearly, I was already performing it well. I was the stabilizer, the one who kept things moving smoothly. When tensions arose, eyes turned to me, not to speak, but to absorb. My reactions set the emotional temperature. If I stayed calm, everything stayed calm. That was my value. When the extended family talked about the future, they spoke to my husband. When logistics needed handling, they spoke to me. When emotions surfaced, I managed them, usually my own first. I realized I was expected to be reliable, useful, and invisible, in that order. No one questioned my competence. No one doubted my commitment. They simply assumed my availability. And I reinforced that assumption every time I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. At some point, the conversations about children stopped, including uncertainty altogether. They became procedural. Doctors were mentioned, schedules discussed, advice offered, unsolicited, confidently, as if a collective decision had already been made, and I was simply being looped in. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, that spontaneity was replaced by planning. Those feelings were less important than outcomes. But there was a difference I couldn't ignore anymore. Plans were being made around me, not with me. My husband would say things like, "It makes sense to do this sooner rather than later," or "We don't want to risk complications." He framed everything as a concern. And because it sounded reasonable, I struggled to name the cost. When I hesitated, even slightly, the response was never anger. It was disappointing. Disappointment is harder to fight. It makes you feel selfish for wanting space. I started adjusting preemptively. I organized my work to be more flexible. I reduced travel. I began aligning my life with an outcome I hadn't explicitly chosen. Each adjustment felt small, responsible, mature, but taken together, they formed a quiet surrender. I wasn't losing autonomy in a dramatic way. I was trading it, piece by piece, for approval. And approval is addictive when it's conditional. I noticed how praise was distributed. I was admired most when I was accommodating. When I asked questions, the energy shifted. When I complied, it returned. That feedback loop taught me exactly who I was supposed to be. The realization came one evening when my husband said, almost absent mindedly, "You'd be such a good mother. You're already so good at taking care of everything." It was meant as a compliment, but it landed like a verdict. Because what he saw as evidence of readiness, I recognized as proof of overextension. My ability to manage didn't mean I wanted to manage more. It meant I had learned how to survive within expectations. I asked him quietly, "Do you ever wonder if I want something different?" He looked at me, genuinely puzzled. "Different from what?" he asked. "From the role, from the script, from the version of me that existed primarily to support the future everyone else imagined." But I didn't say that. I didn't have the language yet. Instead, I nodded and let the conversation move on. That's how roles solidify, not through force, but through lack of interruption. I started to see myself through their eyes. A constant, a given, someone whose consent was assumed because she had never withdrawn it. And that scared me more than any argument could have. Because if no one noticed my inner resistance, how would they notice when it became something else? I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting. I was still hoping that once I fulfilled this role completely, the pressure would lift, that security would follow compliance, that love would become less conditional once I proved myself fully. I didn't realize I was already proving something I never wanted to audition for. And once a role is assigned and performed well, stepping out of it feels like betrayal. That was the trap. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where I could point and say, "That's when everything changed." It happened on a weekday morning, in the most ordinary way possible. I was sitting alone in a clinic waiting room, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. The appointment had been framed as just informational. No commitment, no decision, just gathering data. That's what we called it. Around me, other women sat quietly. Some were pregnant, some looked nervous, some distracted. The room hummed with low voices and soft footsteps. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, and yet I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over me. When the nurse called my name, I stood up and followed her down the hallway. She asked routine questions: age, medical history, family background. At one point, she looked up from her screen and asked, "Is this something you want or something you feel pressured to do?" The question was neutral, professional, probably asked dozens of times a day. But my body reacted before my mind did. I couldn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I had never been asked so directly. Not by a stranger, not without context, not without assumption. I heard myself say, "I think it's complicated." She nodded, not surprised. "It often is," she said. That was it. No advice, no commentary. But something inside me loosened. For the first time in a long while, my inner world felt visible, even if only for a moment, to someone who didn't know me at all. On the walk home afterward, I didn't put on music. I just walked, slowly. I replayed the question in my head. Is this something you want? Not what makes sense. Not what's expected. Not what keeps the peace. What I wanted. I realized how long it had been since that question had guided any of my decisions. By the time I reached our apartment, I understood something quietly but clearly. I wasn't being carried toward a future. I was being guided, gently, persistently, away from myself. That night, my husband asked how the appointment went. "Fine," I said. "Informative." He smiled, relieved. "Good. So we're moving forward then." It wasn't phrased as a question. I looked at him and felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. I saw the entire structure of our dynamic in that moment. How momentum had replaced consent. how my silence had been translated into agreement, and how easily my life could continue on a path I hadn't actively chosen, simply because I didn't interrupt it. I didn't correct him, not then. Instead, I went to bed early. I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the apartment. I thought about how many decisions I had made reactively, in response to expectations, timelines, pressures framed as care. I thought about how strength had been defined in my life, how often it meant endurance rather than direction. And I realized something that frightened me with its simplicity. If I didn't choose deliberately soon, my life would choose for me. That realization didn't make me brave overnight. It didn't give me a plan, but it changed the way I saw my silence. Up until then, silence had felt like something that happened to me, a byproduct of being accommodating. That night, it became something else, a pause, a space. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't confront. I didn't confess. I didn't demand. I observed. I started paying attention to how often decisions were presented as already settled. How frequently was my agreement assumed rather than sought? And instead of correcting it immediately, I let that awareness sharpen. Because clarity, I learned, doesn't always demand action right away. Sometimes it asks for patience. For the first time, my quiet wasn't about keeping peace. It was about listening to myself. Once you realize you can choose silence, it stops feeling like absence. It becomes presence, directed inward. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. I still attended family dinners. I still answered questions politely. I still nodded at the plans being discussed. But something fundamental had shifted in me. I stopped filling in gaps. When someone made a statement about the future, I didn't rush to reassure them. When my husband spoke in conclusions, I didn't immediately align myself. I let sentences end where they ended. At first, no one noticed. Silence is most invisible when people are used to it. But inside, I was no longer disappearing. I was observing. I started to see how quickly others grew uncomfortable when I didn't make smooth transitions. How often they relied on my responses to keep conversations flowing. When I paused, even briefly, the rhythm faltered. It wasn't malicious, it was habitual. My husband began checking in more, not emotionally, but strategically. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening. "Just tired," I replied, which was true, though not in the way he meant. He accepted that answer easily. Tiredness fit the role. It required no adjustment from him. That's when I understood something important. As long as my silence could be explained in ways that didn't challenge expectations, it was safe. So I let it be explained that way. In private, I began doing something I had never prioritized before. I listened to myself without translating my thoughts into acceptable language. I acknowledged fear without minimizing it. I acknowledged resistance without labeling it as immaturity. I acknowledged grief for a version of myself that had believed compliance would lead to security. I also acknowledged something harder: hope. Not hope that things would improve if I endured, but hope that I could still redirect my life, even now. That hope required information, clarity, grounding. So I began gathering it. Quietly, I read. I learned. I asked neutral questions framed as curiosity rather than dissent. I paid attention to legal, medical, and financial implications, not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I wanted to understand the full landscape of the choices being presented to me. The more I learned, the more my silence deepened. Not from fear, but from focus. Others mistook it for compliance. They interpreted my lack of resistance as acceptance. My husband spoke more confidently about timelines. His family relaxed, and in a way, that made my position clearer because I could see exactly how quickly certainty filled the space where my voice used to be. There was a moment when his mother said, "She's not worried. She trusts the process." She said it kindly, assuredly. I smiled gently. Inside, I thought, "You have no idea what I trust now." My silence was no longer passive, it was selective. I stopped volunteering emotional labor. I stopped preemptively fixing misunderstandings. I let assumptions stand, not to deceive, but to understand how far they would go on their own. And what I learned was this: when people are comfortable benefiting from your quiet, they rarely ask what it costs you. That knowledge didn't harden me, it clarified me. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't seeking validation. I was gathering leverage, not over others, but over my own future. And leverage begins with understanding. I still didn't know what I would choose, only that I would choose consciously. There was no secret satisfaction in this phase, no thrill, just steadiness. For the first time, my calm wasn't serving everyone else first, it was serving me. What they never noticed was how much work I stopped doing for them. Not the visible work, the scheduling, the planning, the day to day logistics. I still did those. That was part of the camouflage. The surface remained intact. What disappeared was the invisible labor. I stopped cushioning truths before they landed. I stopped reframing discomfort into something palatable. I stopped convincing myself on everyone else's behalf. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how often conversations assumed outcomes without checking consent, how decisions were described as natural progress rather than choices, how concern was used as a substitute for listening. And while they spoke freely, confidently, I began documenting, not on paper, not in a way that looked strategic. I documented internally patterns, language, timelines. I noticed that every argument for urgency benefited someone else more than it benefited me. I noticed how frequently risk was framed as my responsibility, while reward was framed as ours. And I noticed how quickly my identity narrowed in other people's minds once reproduction entered the conversation. That narrowing was subtle but relentless. I also started asking questions, the kind that didn't trigger an alarm. What happens if things don't go as planned? How do people usually handle the transition emotionally? What options exist if priorities change later? These questions were always answered politely, confidently, incompletely, because no one likes to explore contingencies that challenge certainty. But I did. I learned about legal frameworks, about financial dependencies that form quietly once certain thresholds are crossed, about how autonomy can be compromised not through force, but through default arrangements no one questions until it's too late. None of this felt rebellious. It felt responsible. I wasn't trying to escape. I was trying to see clearly. At home, I noticed how my husband spoke about the future when I wasn't in the room versus when I was. How certain phrases were softened in my presence, but remained unchanged in substance. I noticed how easily my internal conflict went undetected. Not because it was hidden well, but because no one was looking for it. That's the thing about being perceived as easy. People stopped checking. The more I learned, the quieter I became, not out of fear, but out of alignment. I stopped explaining my inner process, not because it was secret, but because It was no longer up for negotiation. They mistook that shift for trust. She's calm, they said. She's ready, they said. She understands, they said. And in a way, they were right. I did understand, far more than they realized. I understood that once certain lines were crossed, returning to neutrality would be impossible. That some decisions, once enacted, rewire power dynamics permanently. I also understood something else, something uncomfortable, that my silence had bought me time. Time to observe how quickly everyone else became invested in an outcome they believed was guaranteed. Time to see how little room there was for deviation once momentum took hold. And time to decide whether I was willing to trade my autonomy for belonging. That question haunted me quietly, because belonging is powerful. It promises safety, it promises recognition, it promises that if you comply, you won't be alone. But autonomy promises something different. It promises honesty, even when it costs you comfort. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was being unfair, if my quiet preparation made me deceptive. But each time I came back to the same truth. No one had asked me to speak openly. They had only asked me to comply. Preparation wasn't betrayal, it was self respect arriving late. They never noticed when my questions stopped being emotional and started being structural, when my concerns shifted from how this will feel to what does this lock in. They never noticed when I began envisioning futures that didn't center on preserving the current one. And most of all, they never noticed when my hope changed shape. It stopped being a hope that things would work out if I endured. It became a hope that I could live honestly, even if it meant loss. That kind of hope doesn't announce itself, it waits. The reveal didn't come with shock. There was no gasp, no moment where I had to sit down, because the truth was too heavy to hold standing up. It arrived quietly, almost gently, the way facts do when you finally stop resisting them. I was alone when it happened, sitting at the kitchen table late at night, laptop open, papers spread out in a careful order. Not because I was frantic, but because I was methodical. I had reached the end of a line of inquiry I didn't even realize I'd been following. Medical information, legal implications, financial interdependence. All the pieces I had been gathering, one by one, finally aligned into something unmistakable. And what I saw was this. Once I crossed the next threshold, my ability to choose freely would narrow. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. Not because anyone planned to trap me, not because there was malice, but because systems don't require intent to take effect. The reveal wasn't about my husband specifically. It was about the architecture of the life being built around me and how little room it left for reversal. I realized that what was being framed as a shared future actually placed disproportionate risk on me, my body, my career trajectory, my financial flexibility, my margin for error. Everyone else's lives would expand, mine would consolidate. And the most unsettling part was how normalized that consolidation was. It was spoken of as love, as a responsibility, as maturity. I wasn't discovering betrayal, I was discovering an imbalance. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, hands folded, breathing slowly. There was no anger, just clarity. I saw how easily my devotion had been converted into expectation, how my adaptability had been mistaken for consent to permanent sacrifice. And I saw something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. If I moved forward the way everyone assumed I would, the person I was becoming would no longer belong to me. That realization didn't make me dramatic. It made me still. Because when you finally see the cost of a decision clearly, There's nothing left to debate. I thought about the narrative I had been telling myself, that this was about saving my marriage, about preserving love, about fulfilling a shared dream. But the truth was more complicated. I wasn't trying to save something broken. I was trying to prevent being left behind by a version of love that only worked if I kept shrinking. That was the private reveal. Not that my husband didn't care, not that his family was cruel, but the system we were building required my silence to function. And that silence, once locked in by irreversible commitments, would no longer be a choice. I understood then why I had felt so compelled to prepare quietly, because on some level, I had known this moment was coming. The knowledge didn't tell me what to do next, but it removed all illusion that doing nothing was neutral. I went to bed that night without making a decision, but I slept differently, not restlessly, not anxiously, with the calm that comes when denial ends. The next morning, my husband kissed me goodbye and said, "We're almost there." I smiled because I knew something he didn't yet understand. There is a difference between being close to a milestone and being close to a point of no return. And I was standing at the edge of it, fully awake. Decision points are often imagined as dramatic crossroads. This one wasn't. There was no countdown, no ultimatum, no single sentence forced my hand. What made it decisive was not pressure, it was clarity. I knew the options. I had mapped them carefully. I could stop everything, speak plainly, risk destabilizing the marriage by asserting myself fully, openly, now. That path offered honesty, but no guarantee of safety. It was assumed that my voice would be received as equal, something experience had not supported. I could continue delaying, keep gathering time through politeness and ambiguity. But that path was eroding quickly. Momentum had its own gravity, and I was already being pulled. Or I could choose the path everyone expected, not because I was unaware of the cost, but because I understood it completely. That was the option no one thought I would question anymore. And that was why it became the irreversible one. People assume irreversible decisions are made out of blindness or desperation. Mine wasn't. It was made with open eyes. I chose to move forward. Not because I believed it would fix everything, not because I believed it was fair, but because I believed I could carry the cost, and that carrying it might finally secure my place. That's the quiet logic no one talks about. When you've been conditioned to equate endurance with worth, choosing sacrifice feels like agency. I told myself I was strong enough. I told myself I was informed enough. I told myself that once the next stage was reached, my voice would matter more. I didn't frame it as surrender. I framed it as a strategy. If I moved forward deliberately, consciously, maybe I could shape the outcome from within. Maybe love, once stabilized, would soften. Maybe recognition would follow responsibility. I didn't tell anyone about the full extent of my hesitation. I didn't dramatize my consent. I simply stopped resisting. When I told my husband I was ready, he looked relieved in a way that was almost childlike. "Thank you," he said. Not "I love you," not "I see you." Thank you. That word lodged itself somewhere deep. From that point on, things moved quickly, as if the universe had been waiting for my permission to proceed. Appointments, plans, conversations filled with certainty. Everyone relaxed. And I told myself, this is what commitment feels like. But beneath the calm, something else settled in. A narrowing, not fear, not regret. A sense that something had been placed on a track that would not bend for anyone, including me. I was no longer observing from the outside. I was inside the machinery. The night before the final step, I stood in the bathroom, looking at my reflection longer than usual. I wasn't searching for doubt. I was mesmerized. The woman who still belonged entirely to herself. I touched the silver necklace at my throat, the one constant I had carried through every version of myself, and promised silently that I would not disappear completely. That promise felt important, necessary, and impossible to define. The next day, as we moved forward, I felt a strange duality. I was present, cooperative, calm, and somewhere beneath that, I was already grieving. Not because I didn't want what was coming, but because I understood what it would cost to want it honestly. This was the point of no return, not because of biology, not because of fate, but because I had chosen to believe that love would finally meet me halfway once I proved how much I was willing to give. I didn't know then that some systems don't rebalance after sacrifice. They recalibrate around it. And once they do, the person who carried the weight is no longer seen as choosing, only as responsible. After the decision was made, everything became quieter, not externally, but internally. On the surface, life looked stable, even hopeful. People spoke with confidence now, with relief. Plans had a direction, conversations had an endpoint. Inside me, something had shifted into a narrow, focused stillness. I didn't announce changes. I didn't explain myself. I didn't seek reassurance. I moved in silence, not because I was hiding something, but because nothing I was doing required permission anymore. I began making practical adjustments that appeared harmless, even supportive. I reorganized my finances under the guise of efficiency. I reviewed documents I had previously signed without question. I learned which decisions required mutual consent and which did not. I wasn't dismantling anything. I was understanding the structure I was inside. At work, I quietly secured more autonomy. I renegotiated responsibilities in ways that preserved flexibility without triggering concern. I made sure my professional identity didn't dissolve into contingency plans that assumed I would eventually step back. No one objected. No one noticed. At home, I reduced my emotional visibility. I didn't stop caring. I stopped narrating. I didn't bring up concerns unless they were logistical. I let my husband experience confidence uninterrupted. He mistook my composure for peace. In truth, it was containment. Containment of fear. Containment of doubt. Containment of the knowledge that once certain outcomes occurred, renegotiation would no longer be an option. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being praised while internally preparing for loss. People congratulated us, spoke about how settled we seemed, how everything was finally aligning. I smiled. I thanked them. I said all the correct things. What they didn't see was how carefully I was measuring what remained under my control and what was already slipping beyond it. I didn't sabotage. I didn't resist. I complied strategically. Because once you are inside a system that rewards your silence, open rebellion costs more than quiet positioning. My husband grew more relaxed. He talked more freely about the future. He spoke as if certainty had removed the need for negotiation. And in a way, it had. Not because I had agreed with everything, but because I had stopped interrupting momentum. He didn't notice that I stopped sharing certain thoughts, that I stopped asking questions that invited dialogue, that I stopped seeking emotional reassurance. Those absences blended seamlessly into the image of a woman who had finally accepted her role. Acceptance is easy to perform and dangerous to misinterpret. There were moments when I almost spoke, when the weight of what I was carrying pressed hard against my ribs and demanded release. But I held, not out of fear, but because timing matters. I wasn't waiting for a collapse. I was bracing for consequences. Because deep down, I knew something no one else seemed to consider. Once everything was in place, the system would reveal itself, not through cruelty, but through indifference. It would function exactly as designed, and the person who had given the most would be expected to give more because she always had. I moved through those weeks like someone memorizing a building they would one day leave, counting exits, noting which doors locked automatically, which required keys, which were never meant to be opened from the inside. I didn't know when I would need that knowledge, only that I would. Moving in silence wasn't about control over others. It was about preserving myself long enough to face what was coming without losing clarity. Because the truth was this: I had made an irreversible decision, believing it would secure love. Now, I was quietly preparing for the possibility that love, once secured, would no longer require my consent. And when that happened, I needed to be awake. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way tides do, predictably, steadily, without asking whether you were ready to be submerged. At first, they were subtle enough to be mistaken for normal adjustment. My time was no longer entirely my own. Decisions about my body, my schedule, my energy were discussed as shared concerns, but enacted as expectations. What had once been framed as support began to feel like supervision. People checked in more often, not to ask how I felt, but to assess progress. How are things going? Are you being careful enough? You need to rest more. Concern has a way of sounding gentle while quietly claiming authority. I noticed how conversations shifted away from me and toward outcomes. How my inner life became secondary to the role I was now fulfilling. How my fatigue was interpreted as something to manage rather than something to understand. My husband became more attentive, but less curious. He adjusted logistics. He handled tasks. He praised my strength. What he didn't do was ask whether the strength was costing me something. Because now, the cost was assumed. I began to feel a strange kind of invisibility again. Different from before, but familiar. This time, I was not overlooked. I was accounted for. My body was no longer private territory. My limits were discussed as variables. My discomfort was weighed against long-term benefit. No one was unkind. That's what made it so disorienting. Kindness doesn't negate harm when it replaces consent. I noticed how easily my silence was interpreted as resilience. How quickly concern turned into expectation. You're handling this so well. I don't know how you do it. You're amazing. Each compliment felt heavier than the last because they left no room for me to struggle without disappointing someone. The irony was painful. I had moved forward believing this choice would stabilize my place, that it would finally make my needs undeniable. Instead, it had rendered them irrelevant. Once the system was in motion, my interior world became an inconvenience. There were moments when I tried to speak, not dramatically, just small truths. I'm exhausted. I'm not sure I can keep this space. I need space. The responses were immediate and practical. Of course, let's adjust. We'll get through this. It's temporary. Temporary is a powerful word. It asks you to endure indefinitely. I started to see how easily responsibility shifts once sacrifice is normalized. How quickly gratitude fades when effort becomes expected. The family who once spoke carefully around me now spoke confidently. Plans expanded. Expectations multiplied. I had become the axis around which everything else rotated. And axes don't get to move. There was a moment that crystallized it. My husband said, We're almost past the hard part. We. But it was my body that ached. My career was paused. My autonomy has narrowed. The we had become symbolic, comforting, but imprecise. That night, alone in the dark, I realized something that landed like a quiet truth I could no longer avoid. I had secured my place, but at the cost of my voice. The system was functioning perfectly, just not for me. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The consequences weren't loud, they weren't cruel, they were structural, and they had already begun. There is a moment when effort stops feeling meaningful, not because you're tired, but because you realize the outcome no longer depends on how much you give. That's when I understood it was too late to fix things. Not in a dramatic sense. Nothing had collapsed. No one had walked away. From the outside, life still looked intact, even successful. But internally, the margin was gone. Every attempt to adjust was met with solutions that preserved the structure, not my autonomy. Every expression of strain was met with reassurance that assumed continuation, not reconsideration. I wasn't being heard because the system no longer needed to hear me. It was already optimized. I remember sitting across from my husband one evening, watching him talk through plans for the next year. He spoke carefully, thoughtfully. He truly believed he was including me. And yet, as he spoke, I realized none of the options he presented included a version of me that could step back. There was only forward. I interrupted him gently. What if I can't do this the way we planned? I asked. He paused, not in anger, in confusion. What do you mean? He said. We're already in it. That sentence ended something. Not the marriage, not the partnership. The illusion that renegotiation was still possible. I understood then that timing is not just about readiness, it's about leverage. And my leverage had been spent the moment I proved I was willing to carry the weight without protest. I wasn't trapped, I was locked in by expectations. That distinction matters because it's harder to escape something everyone believes you agree to freely. I tried briefly to reclaim language, to articulate the cost in ways that couldn't be dismissed as temporary stress. But the responses grew less curious over time. Everyone goes through this. You're stronger than you think. It will be worth it. Worth it. For whom? That question stayed unspoken because I already knew the answer. The tragedy wasn't that no one cared. It was that caring no longer required listening. My husband began to show signs of stress too, but his was visible, acknowledged, and accommodated. Mine was internal, reframed as resilience. I became careful about when I spoke, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to waste words. Words only matter when they can still change something. I started to mourn quietly, not just the life I might have had, but the version of myself who believed sacrifice would be met with reciprocity. That belief had been sincere, and it had cost me more than I anticipated. The realization that it was too late didn't come with panic, it came with a strange calm. Because once you accept that something cannot be fixed, you stop trying to perform hope for others. You stop explaining. You stop convincing. You stop negotiating with a structure that has already decided how it will function. Instead, you focus on what remains. And what remained for me was this: my integrity, my awareness, my ability to decide who I would be within the consequences I had chosen. That wasn't freedom, but it was honesty. And honesty, at that point, was all I had left. The confrontation didn't look like one. There was no explosion, no list of grievances, no raised voices demanding accountability. By the time I spoke, the fire had already burned itself out. What remained was clarity. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once spread papers and quietly realized the truth of my situation. The light was low, the house was quiet. Nothing about the moment suggested significance. That felt fitting. I need to tell you something, I said. My husband looked up, attentive but unguarded. He expected logistics, adjustments, something solvable. I'm not okay, I continued, and I haven't been for a long time. He frowned slightly, processing. You should have said something sooner, he replied. I nodded. I know. That acknowledgement disarmed him more than any accusation could have. I didn't blame him. I didn't recount every moment of dismissal, every small cut, every normalization of my silence. I didn't need to. Instead, I spoke about impact. I agreed to things believing they would bring us closer, I said. But what they did was remove space for me to exist as myself. I became a role that worked well for everyone, except me. He listened, really listened. But listening doesn't always mean understanding. I thought we were aligned, he said quietly. You never said you weren't. I didn't, I replied. That's on me. But alignment isn't real if one person disappears to maintain it. There was no anger in his face, only something like grief. He asked questions, practical ones. What do you want now? What are you saying? I answered honestly. I don't want to fight, I said. And I don't want to pretend anymore. I can't continue like this. I wasn't threatening to leave. I wasn't demanding change. I was stating a boundary that arrived too late to reverse everything, but not too late to define myself. The room felt heavy, but not hostile. He tried then to fix it, to promise adjustments, to suggest compromises, to reframe the future with softer edges. And for a moment, I saw how sincere he was. But sincerity doesn't undo structure. I believe you want to help, I said. I just don't believe the system we're in allows it, without costing me more than I have left. That was the hardest thing to say, because it meant accepting that love alone couldn't solve this. We sat in silence after that. Not the old silence, the kind that erased me, but a shared one, filled with acknowledgement. Nothing was resolved that night, but something was named, and once named, it could no longer be ignored. That was the confrontation, quiet, measured, irreversible in its own way. Who I am now is not who I thought I would become. I used to imagine that clarity would feel triumphant, like a clean break, a decisive ending that reclaims everything at once. It doesn't. Clarity is quieter than that. It settles into you and asks you to live differently, not dramatically. I'm more precise now. I choose words carefully. I don't offer explanations unless they're asked for. And even then, I don't overextend. I no longer translate my needs into something easier for others to accept. If something matters, I say it plainly. If it doesn't, I let it pass. This didn't make me colder. It made me honest. I understand now how easily being strong can become a way for others to stop protecting you. How competence invites assumption. How silence can be praised until it erases you. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I also don't rewrite the past to absolve myself. I participated in my own disappearance. I believed that if I carried enough, I would be carried in return. That belief didn't make me weak. It made me human. What changed is that I no longer build my identity around being necessary. I built it around being whole. My relationships are smaller now, more intentional. I don't perform stability for comfort. I allow pauses. I allow disagreement. I allow myself to be seen even when it's inconvenient. Some people adjusted, some didn't. That taught me something important. Belonging that requires self erasure isn't belonging, it's containment. I'm not bitter. Truly. Bitterness comes from believing something was stolen from you. What I lost, I gave, with incomplete information, but with sincerity. I can grieve that without turning it into blame. I carry responsibility without punishment now, and I forgive myself for learning late. I still wear the silver necklace, not as a reminder of what I endured, but of continuity, of the person who existed before roles, before expectations, before sacrifice, was mistaken for love. She never disappeared. She waited. I don't speak loudly about what happened. I don't need to. My life is quieter now, but it's aligned. An alignment is a form of peace that doesn't require applause. I know my limits. I honor them. I don't negotiate them against someone else's comfort. That's who I am now, not someone who won, not someone who escaped without loss, but someone who stopped disappearing, even when it cost her certainty. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of strength. There are stories that end with justice and stories that end with victory. This one ends with truth, not the kind that restores everything you lost, but the kind that prevents you from losing yourself again. For a long time, I believed that love was proven through sacrifice, that if I gave enough, endured enough, adjusted enough, I would eventually arrive at a place where my needs mattered just as much. What I didn't understand then is that systems built on quiet endurance don't rebalance when you give more. They stabilize. And once they stabilize, they expect consistency, not consent. The tragedy in my story isn't that I trusted love, it's that I trusted silence to protect me. Silence can buy time, it can preserve harmony, it can even feel like control. But silence cannot negotiate on your behalf. What I learned, too late but not uselessly, is that irreversible decisions don't always come from pressure. Sometimes they come from hope, from the belief that this one last sacrifice will finally secure safety. And sometimes that belief becomes the chain. I don't regret wanting to save my marriage, wanting connection, stability, family. Those desires are not flaws, they are deeply human. What I regret is not asking one question early enough, loudly enough. Who do I become if this works exactly as planned? Because not all success is survivable. If there is one moral in this story, it's not don't sacrifice. Life asks that of us sometimes. It's this: never make a permanent decision based on the hope that someone else will change once you disappear enough. Love that requires you to shrink will not expand to meet you later. And strength that is only rewarded with more weight is not strength. It's exploitation dressed as admiration. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something, still quiet, still being strong, still telling yourself it will make sense later, I hope you pause, not to panic, not to rebel, just to ask yourself honestly, am I choosing this? Or am I allowing momentum to choose for me? You don't need drama to reclaim yourself. You don't need revenge. You don't even need certainty. Sometimes, all you need is to stop disappearing before the cost becomes permanent. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it resonated with you or unsettled you, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever made a choice believing it would save something, only to realize it slowly cost you yourself? Share in the comments if you're comfortable. You're not alone, even when the story is quiet.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.